You ever walk into a place you thought you understood, only to feel it studying you instead? That's what it felt like the day I walked back into the home my brother sold out from under me. The air had that stale sweetness of old wood left too long in silence, and I swear the house knew something I didn't. Before I go any further, pull up a chair with me for a moment. I'm not here to lecture you or drag you along. Just stay if you want to hear how an old place can tell the truth better than the people who grew up in it. I was sitting on my porch that morning, letting the sun warm the bad knee I always keep complaining about, when my neighbor handed me a letter. Thick envelope, no return address. Inside was the notice. The sale had gone through. Our childhood home, mine and my brother's, wasn't ours anymore, and the ink on the paper had already dried. I called him 3 times. He didn't pick up once. That silence told me everything I needed to know about how long he'd been planning it. I could almost hear my mother's voice in the back of my mind, the way she used to say a lie doesn't need noise to make itself heard. When I drove over there, the house looked smaller than I remembered. Happens when you get older, I suppose, or when the people tied to a place start treating it like a burden instead of a memory. The front door stuck the same way it always did in the winter, even though it was warm outside. I pushed it open and that old familiar smell hit me. Dust, cedar, and a faint trace of my father's pipe tobacco, like it had soaked into the beams 50 years ago and just never left. Every step I took inside felt heavier than the last, not because of age, though believe me, that doesn't help, but because something in the quiet felt wrong. You live long enough, you learn the difference between an empty house and a house that's holding its breath. I made my way through the living room, and the sunlight was spilling in across the floor, just the way it used to when my mother would lay out her sewing. Funny how a beam of light can punch a hole straight through your chest when you're not ready for it. The silence had weight to it, like the house was waiting for me to notice something. My brother and I used to race down that hallway when we were kids. Bare feet slapping against the boards, our father yelling after us not to shake the nails loose. I ran my hand along the wall as I walked, feeling the little dents left by years of picture frames. It was strange seeing them empty. You don't realize how much life a wall holds until it's stripped bare. There was a draft near the far end of the hall, a soft, cool ribbon of air brushing against my ankle. That didn't make sense. All the windows were shut. I pressed down with my foot and heard a creak that didn't sound familiar. Not the usual tired groan of old wood, more like a warning, a kind of uneven give that made the hair on my arms rise. I knelt down slower than I used to, letting my knee remind me of all the years I've put on it. My fingers brushed the floor. Dust, a little grit, a faint smell of damp wood. I pressed again, and the plank shifted just slightly, just enough to tell me it wasn't resting on anything solid. For a moment, I just stayed there, thinking, feeling that same old weight behind my ribs. My brother had been in this house days before the sale. The realtor said he'd cleaned out every room alone, and that's when something in the back of my mind started whispering that he hadn't just been cleaning, he'd been hiding. There was a time he would have told me everything. Before the divorce, before the drinking, before the shame he never talked about started eating the good parts of him like rot under paint. I slid my fingers along the edge of the plank. The wood was rough, splintered in a way it wouldn't be unless someone lifted it recently. I took a breath that tasted like old dust and memory, hooked my fingers under the edge, and lifted. The board came up easier than it should have. Underneath was darkness. Not the empty kind, no. This was the kind of darkness that feels like it's been holding its own breath for years, waiting for someone to finally look it in the eye. When I lifted that board, the rest of the world seemed to hush, like even the wind outside leaned in to see what I was about to uncover. The space beneath wasn't wide, maybe the depth of my forearm, but it was enough to hold something. Enough for someone to hide what they couldn't stand to face. I eased myself down onto one knee, ignoring the sharp complaint that shot through the joint, and let my eyes adjust. At first all I saw was the dust swirling in the thin strip of light from the hallway window. Then something caught the beam, metal, maybe brass, dulled by age. My hand hesitated above the opening. I don't know if it was fear or respect, or maybe just the weight of memory, but I let myself breathe for a moment before reaching in. The wood around the hole felt cool, as if the air down there hadn't moved in years. My fingers brushed against fabric first. Rough canvas, stiff with time. I pulled it up slowly. It was a small drawstring bag, the kind our father used to keep screws and nails in when he taught us how to fix things properly the first time. That man believed every secret eventually rusted through if you didn't handle it right. The bag was heavier than I expected. Something solid clinked softly inside, a muted little sound that made my stomach twist. Whatever it was, my brother had meant to keep it hidden, maybe forever. I loosened the string and tipped the contents into my palm. 2 objects fell out. The first was a small silver locket, our mother's. I felt the air leave me in one long exhale. I hadn't seen it since the night she passed. My brother had sworn he couldn't find it. I always believed him. Or maybe I wanted to. The second object was what stopped my breath entirely, a small brass key, scuffed along one edge. I knew that key. I knew exactly what it opened. Our father's tool chest. The big one. The one he locked after that night, after the accident none of us liked to talk about. The one he told us to leave closed until we're old enough to understand the cost of a mistake. I was 15 then. My brother was 12, and he was the one who'd gone near it when he shouldn't have. I remember shouting. I remember the crack of something metal hitting the floor, and I remember the way our father's hands trembled as he closed the lid and turned that same brass key. Whatever was in there, it wasn't a harmless keepsake. My brother had stolen the key, hidden it, lied about it for decades, and now he'd buried it under the floorboards of a house he intended to disappear behind him like it was nothing more than a reminder he could sweep under the rug. I stared at those 2 objects in my palm, feeling that familiar slow burn of heartbreak rising from somewhere old and tired inside me. If he took the locket to keep a piece of Mom close, I could forgive that. But the key, that key had always been heavy with something more than metal. I set the locket down on the floor beside me and held the key up to the light. My fingers were shaking, not from anger, but from the cold realization that my brother hadn't sold the house for money. He'd sold it to bury the past, to bury what he'd done, to bury what he'd broken. And suddenly the silence in the house wasn't just silence anymore. It felt like something holding its breath, waiting for me to see the whole picture. I went to the garage. The door groaned the same way it always had, and the smell hit me instantly. Oil, old wood, and that faint bite of metal. My father's smell. The chest sat against the far wall, covered with a tarp but unmistakable in its shape. I lifted the corner of the tarp, and dust floated through the air like tiny ghosts losing their grip. The chest looked smaller than I remembered, but maybe that's what time does. Shrinks the monsters until you dare to face them. The brass lock was still there. Same scratches, same weight in the air around it. My hand hovered over the keyhole. I hesitated, just like I did when I was 15 standing outside this very garage. Back then, I'd walked away. I'd let my father keep the secrets he thought were his alone to shoulder. But now it wasn't his secret anymore. It was my brother's, and he'd built his entire adult life around hiding it. I pushed the key in. It slid smoother than it had any right to after all these years. The click of the lock opening echoed in the garage like a shout. Inside were tools, yes, but underneath them, wrapped in an old shirt, was something else. I lifted the bundle and set it on the workbench. When I unwrapped it, the first thing I saw was the handle of a flashlight. My father's old one. Its lens cracked clean down the middle. I remembered that flashlight. I remembered it rolling across the floor the night of the accident. And under it, a folded piece of paper. Yellowed, edges brittle. My father's handwriting on the front. For when the truth can't wait anymore. My throat tightened. I unfolded it slowly. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. But those lines changed everything I thought I knew about that night. About my father, about my brother, and about the burden that had been living under our floorboards all these years. As I read, my hands went cold. The house didn't feel silent anymore. It felt awake, listening. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something inside me shift. Not anger, not revenge, but certainty. The kind that tells you the next step you take will change everything. I stood there in the garage holding that letter, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. Not from age, not from nerves, from the weight of what my father had written all those years ago. His handwriting had always been steady, but on that page, you could see the strain in every stroke, like the truth itself fought him even as he tried to put it down. He wrote that the accident wasn't my brother's fault the way everyone believed. Wasn't mine either. He said he'd kept quiet because he didn't want either of us to grow up thinking we'd broken something that couldn't be fixed. But shame has a way of settling into a young boy's bones before he even understands the story he's living in. And my father made one mistake. Just one, that shaped decades of silence. My brother had knocked over the flashlight during an argument we never talked about. It rolled, hit a metal shelf, and sent down a jar of screws that shattered on the concrete floor. The noise startled Dad while he was cutting a board on the table saw. His hand slipped. That was the accident he'd blamed on his own carelessness. But my brother had heard the adults whisper. He'd seen Dad's bandaged hand, and he'd carried the guilt anyway, quiet and corrosive. I let that sink in, staring down at the letter until the words blurred. My brother had lived his whole life thinking he'd caused that, and instead of confronting it, instead of healing, he'd let the guilt twist him into someone who hid things, lied to himself, pulled away from everyone who ever loved him. Still, that didn't excuse selling the house behind my back. It didn't excuse burying our mother's locket. It didn't excuse pretending I didn't exist whenever responsibility came knocking. Shame might explain his choices, but it didn't erase their impact. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I slipped the key into the other. Then I closed the chest gently, out of respect for the man who'd tried, imperfectly, to shield us. When I went outside, the air smelled like rain was thinking about coming. That thick electric scent that always gave me a strange mix of dread and hope. I got in my truck and drove to my brother's place. I didn't call, didn't text. Whatever came next needed to happen face to face. He lived in a little apartment above a pawn shop. The kind of place that says a man hasn't forgiven himself enough to live somewhere with sunlight. I climbed the stairs slow, every step creaking under me. When I knocked, it took him a long time to answer. He opened the door just wide enough to see me. His eyes went wide like he'd seen a ghost wearing his last name. "Harry, I didn't expect—" "I know," I said. My voice came out steady, too steady. That scared him more than yelling would have. He stepped aside, letting me in. His place smelled like old coffee and the bitterness of someone living on the edge of their own mistakes. He didn't ask how I found out. He knew. I didn't sit. I just stood there, holding the locket in one hand and the key in the other. His eyes locked on them, and his breath hitched. "You weren't supposed to," he started, but his voice trailed off, drowning in the kind of shame that makes a man look older than his years. I walked over to his small kitchen table and set the items down gently. "You want to tell me why you left these under the floorboards of our parents' house? Or why you sold that house without even calling me?" He sank into a chair like his legs had given up. "I couldn't, Harry, I couldn't keep walking past those rooms. Every time I did, I felt like that scared kid again, the one who ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," I said quietly. He let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know what happened." I reached into my pocket and placed the folded letter in front of him. His eyes hovered over it. For a second, he didn't move. Then, with a shaky breath, he opened it. As he read, something inside him cracked. Not loudly, quietly, the way ice breaks under a heavy boot, slow at first, then all at once. His shoulders curled inward and he covered his mouth with his hand. When he finished, he didn't look up. All these years I thought it was my fault," he whispered. "I thought Dad couldn't look at me without remembering." "That's not what the letter says," I replied. "No, but that's what I believed." He wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand. "And I couldn't stand being in that house anymore. Couldn't stand you knowing what I did." "You hid the key," I said. "Why?" He swallowed hard. "Because if you ever opened that chest without Dad, then the truth would land on me. I didn't want you to hate me." I sat down across from him. The chair groaned like it had been waiting years for this moment. "I don't hate you," I said. But I won't lie. What you did hurt. Selling the house without talking to me. That wasn't shame. That was avoidance. He nodded, eyes red. I know. I just wanted to close the door before the past opened up again. It did open, I said. And you didn't handle it, you just buried it deeper. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The rain finally started outside, soft at first, then heavier. The sound filled the room, gentle but relentless. He spoke first. What now? That was the question, wasn't it? The morally complicated one, the one without a clean answer. I'm not going to drag your name through the mud, I said. But I'm not going to pretend nothing happened either. We're going to face this, together. Not as kids hiding in a garage, but as the men we grew up to be. Flawed, tired, and still trying. He nodded slowly like the idea was new and frightening, but maybe possible. I stood. I'm keeping the letter and the locket, but the key, that's yours to decide. He stared at it, the brass catching the dim light. I saw guilt, grief, and something else, relief maybe, flicker across his face. He didn't reach for it, not yet, and that told me more about his state of mind than any apology ever could. I walked to the door, feeling the weight of decades shift just a little in my chest. Before I left, I said, "You're not 12 anymore. You don't have to hide from the truth." He whispered, "I know. But knowing and accepting are two very different things." As I stepped back into the rain, the cool drops tapping against my skin, I wondered what part of this story would hurt more. What he'd done, or what it cost him to carry it alone. Either way, the reckoning had only just begun. I drove home with the kind of quiet that settles deeper than sound. The rain kept coming, steady and unhurried, tapping against the windshield, like it was trying to keep me awake to everything I'd just felt. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't open a window, just let the miles roll under me while my thoughts wandered through all the years my brother and I spent pretending we were fine. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, and the clouds were breaking into soft gray patches. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, watching the water slide down the glass in thin streaks. My father used to say rain had a way of polishing old truths. I never understood what he meant until that evening, sitting alone with a letter written by a man long gone and a key that had haunted two brothers for decades. Inside the house, everything felt smaller than it had that morning. Memories have weight when they shift, and mine were moving around like furniture being dragged from one side of the room to the other. I set the locket on the kitchen counter and rested my hand on it. The metal was cold, but it warmed beneath my palm, and I swear for a moment I could smell my mother's lavender perfume. Soft, faint, the kind that lingers on a sweater kept too long in a drawer. I brewed a pot of coffee, though it was far too late for caffeine. Habit, I guess. The smell filled the room, earthy and familiar. As it brewed, I unfolded the letter and read it again, slower this time. The words didn't change, but they landed differently. My father hadn't been a perfect man. He'd kept the wrong secret for the right reasons, in the wrong way. He'd tied a knot in the truth so tight it eventually strangled the boy he was trying to protect. And my brother, well, shame had grown in him like a shadow that got bigger every time he turned away from the light. When the coffee was done, I poured myself a cup and sat at the table. Steam curled up into the quiet and made it feel like someone was sitting across from me. I thought about calling my brother, thought about driving back and handing him the key outright. But giving a man the truth before he's ready to hold it is like throwing a heavy rope to someone who's still learning how to swim. I decided to give him time. The next morning I woke early, before the sun had fully risen. My joints ached the way they always do when a storm leaves, like they're reminding me of every foolish thing I've ever lifted wrong. I made breakfast, ate half of it, and wrapped up the rest for later. As I washed the dishes, I kept glancing toward the counter where the key still sat. Around noon, my phone rang, my brother's name on the screen. He didn't call much anymore, not since Mom's funeral, not since he started building walls around himself instead of talking through what was breaking him. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was rough, like he'd swallowed gravel. "Harriet, can we talk?" "We already did," I said gently. "What's left?" "A lot," he whispered, "if you're willing." So I told him to come over. When he arrived, he looked like a man who hadn't slept, eyes red, shoulders stiff. He stepped inside and stopped near the doorway like crossing it required permission. I nodded toward the table. "Sit." He did. Hands clasped tight, knuckles pale. I slid the key toward him across the wood. He didn't touch it, but he didn't look away either. "I need you to tell me the truth," he said, voice cracking. "Not the version you think will make me feel better, the real one." So I told him everything, word for word from the letter. How Dad had blamed himself, how he didn't want either of us carrying that weight, how he hid the truth because he thought protecting us meant shielding us from the messiness of the past. My brother listened with his hands pressed to his forehead, elbows on the table. When I finished, he let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for years. "It wasn't supposed to go like this," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to sell the house to hurt you." I leaned back. "Then why didn't you call me?" "Because I thought you'd tell me to face it, and I wasn't ready to." He paused. "I'm still not sure I am." "That's fair," I said. "Readiness doesn't come all at once. It arrives in pieces." He stared at the key. The metal caught a sliver of sunlight coming through the window. "What do I do with this?" "That's your choice," I said. "You can throw it away, keep it, or open the chest yourself. Just don't hide it again. Secrets rot in the dark." He nodded slowly. "And the house? What about it?" "I can try to reverse the sale, or pay you your share, or—" I raised a hand. "This isn't about money. It never was. I just wanted honesty." He looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry, Harry." "I know." I let out a long breath. "And I'm tired. Tired of being angry. Tired of watching us become strangers to avoid the truth." He swallowed hard. "Can we fix this?" "We can try," I said. "But don't expect quick answers. Healing doesn't run on your schedule or mine." His eyes softened, the first hint of peace I'd seen in him in years. He reached for the key then, just lightly, with 2 fingers, as if touching a memory that might bite. He didn't pick it up. Not yet. But he didn't push it away either. Before he left, he hugged me. Not a big embrace, not emotional. Just a quiet, tired press of arms around shoulders, the kind men our age offer when they're still learning how to say the things they never grew up knowing how to say. When the door closed behind him, I stood there alone in my kitchen, the house silent except for the soft hum of the fridge. I walked to the window and looked out at the clearing sky. Light was breaking through in thin beams, touching the wet pavement until it shimmered. And that's when it settled in my chest. The lesson I wish someone had told me earlier in life. When families break, it's rarely from one big thing. It's from small truths buried under years of fear. Eventually, something shakes the floorboards loose, and when it does, you have a choice. Pretend you didn't hear it, or face whatever's been waiting underneath. If this story found you at the right moment, stay close. I've got another truth to share soon, one about a promise broken, a neighbor who knew too much, and the night everything in my quiet little street changed shape. But for now, take care of your own hidden places. They're louder than you think.